What was your sleep score today? And how much REM did you get? If you have any kind of wearable device, you're probably at least somewhat familiar with digital measures of sleep. Now, as these tools are increasingly used clinically, how do we get accurate and reliable measures? And of course, what are the most important metrics we should be looking at? My guest today is an Associate Program Director at the Digital Medicine Society. She's diving into the research, studying the latest health trackers, and working with clinicians to educate us all on what these core measurements should be when it comes to sleep. This is the Discovery Arc podcast. I am Drew Duglin, and today, let us welcome Piper Fromy.
Well, I guess like on a personal level, we just kind of abuse sleep. There's been a lot more now about the important things that you should do when you sleep, like sleep more, because if you don't sleep enough, 7 to 9 hours a night by the National Sleep Foundation, it does impact. There's morbidity and mortality. You will live less unless you sleep well. But then there's also those concerns of like what if you just can't? What am I doing wrong? Well, there's a huge amount of advice out there about trying to understand your own sleep, and lots of places have done this, National Sleep Foundation included. But putting it all in one place so that we as people can understand our sleep and the measurements we get from our own personal devices is like a really big step forward. And we'll talk a bit about the work we've done later, but that's one of the things that we're really, really proud of, helping people interpret their own sleep metrics so that they can get a better sleep, because it's a pillar of health. And if we don't do sleep right by ourselves, it could affect our health. And if we know we're not doing sleep right, like we need to have like this democratization where people can have the power to understand their sleep and talk to someone who can make their sleep right or help them sleep better to promote longevity and health in general. But from the research point of view, when we've been looking into sleep research as part of our project here, we'll talk about later, what we found is that there's lots of sleep research in sleep conditions. If it's like insomnia or sleep apnea, there's lots of like actual getting people into a lab, into a PSG lab, and seeing what happens. Outside of that, things like depression and Parkinson's, that work may happen, getting you into a sleep lab, but it's costly, and it happens typically when there's a sleep problem associated with it, like sleep apnea alongside that. So the idea here is that if sleep is this important, no matter what your health condition, we should also be looking at sleep, because if your sleep's going to if we're going to try and improve your health condition or predict what's going on in your health condition, sleep can be a big part of that. It can either get better or get worse, and that can be a marker. But how do we do that if everyone has to go into a sleep lab? And then we've got the problem that sleep labs are really, really artificial. They're one night mostly in a condition where you're not at home in your own bed. You're hooked up to loads and loads and loads of wires. And yeah, you're not getting a normal night's sleep. So trying to really to measure sleep in its natural world at home in your bed is what we're trying to do here, to make it open and available for everyone from every research walk of life and further.
Yeah, it seems like that's always been such a difficult trade-off, right? You get great measurements, but in an artificial environment, or you get, a real-world environment with not great measurements.
Oh, that's it. And I wouldn't say like the real world is not great measurements. It's just different, because like with sleep research, it all came from polysomnography, the measuring brain waves and eye movements, right? So that's how we know from a research point of view what sleep is. Outside the lab, maybe it's actigraphy, a watch that you wear on your wrist, and you get some signal about whether you were still enough to maybe be asleep. But there's all different gradations of what you can do with all different kinds of sensitivity and specificity. What the problem that we have is the transparency and the consistency. If you take one product or another product and they're both trying to measure how long it takes you to get to sleep, something we call sleep onset latency, quite often you don't really know what it's doing under the hood. So you can't compare between like product A and product B, or you don't know like how you can interpret it. So making them transparent and consistent across the field and saying, hey, look, if you want to measure this, try and measure it this way, so everyone's measuring the same thing.
Have you always been interested in sleep? And so, kind of going back further, where's your sort of passion for studying science before that initially come from? What was that your kind of background in growing up?
Yeah, actually, like Yes and no. Like my background was in psychology, so how people work has always been like a thing that I like to do. And professionally, I was in measurement science, so the measurement of how people work and how they get better and how they feel and function has always been a big part of me. That's why I joined the Digital Medicine Society. I used to work, and I still do, in questionnaires and trying to ask people subjectively, but having that supported by objective digital measurements in their own environment is wonderful. So that's the psychology background. But sleep itself, I had like a very amateur interest in sleep. Like during university, I used to try and do lucid dreaming and teach myself to be aware during the dream state. And it's fantastic. I definitely recommend people to try that out. It's very difficult and I can't do it anymore without practice. But then when it came to the opportunity to work on a project, like we've done here at Dime, working with so many different collaborators to try and understand sleep better, I brought a measurement perspective to the table, and they also brought a measurement perspective, but they brought the sleep expertise, and I was able to weave in my sort of patient-centric understanding of measurement with the very hard, like sleep science that people are bringing, and their digital technology at home measurement science as well. So it was a really great experience that I think we all learned something from, and are able to then give back to the field as well.
Oh, that lucid dreaming is so interesting. I've always been curious and I've heard about it. And how do you practice? Because that's where you can kind of control your dreams, right? So how do you practice to get to that stage?
So yeah, it's not so much controlling your dreams. You feel like you're controlling them, but you're just aware of them. And when you're aware of them, you can make choices in your dreams. So, for example, I became aware of a dream, so I wanted to explore the environment. And in one night, I found there was a cave, so I wanted to go into the cave, and there were locked doors. So I was trying to explore what these locked doors were. But as soon as I tried to control the dream, it didn't work. I tried to tell the other characters in my dream that they had to talk to me, and that's when the dream became very bizarre and ended. It sort of collapsed in on itself. But to get to that state, what I used to try and do was sort of focus on something like my hand. I'd put it in front of my face before I slept and say, "This is my hand. If I see it, I'm sleeping. This is my hand. If I see it, I'm sleeping." Just keep doing that for 5 minutes until I fall asleep. And all of a sudden, in your dream, your hand will pop up. You'll try and push it away until you realize, "Oh, hang on, I'm asleep." And it's that awareness of sleeping that was always really fascinating to me.
Is it true that in dreams we have a weirdly uh, inept way of sort of resolving hands? I heard that that's something that we aren't very good at judging. So if if the hand looks weird, it's definitely a dream.
Yeah, no, like I think that's where artificial intelligence gets it from. But no, I've never noticed that, and like I I've done a lot of sleep research last year. Dreams are just like my forte and how I got into it. But what I would say is that time is impossible in dreams. So if you one good marker of being in a dream is looking at a clock, looking at a clock, and seeing if the time is even interpretable, because often it changes.
And you briefly mentioned sort of questionnaires, analytics there. So what were you actually looking at in your PhD and I guess then postdoc work, on the sort of psychology front?
So in my PhD, I was doing autism research. I was trying to understand how people with autism may interpret emotions and things. So we'd do questionnaires and cognitive tests and try and put them together to try and see what was going on. At that point, my knowledge of questionnaires was just how do we use them? Like just take a questionnaire and use it. I didn't really understand much about measurement properties, and I wish I had. Um, but after that, I got into the clinical outcomes assessment field in pharma, where we use questionnaires to try and understand people's behaviours. And I picked up um, the profession of psychometrics, which is understanding validity, reliability. Like, am I measuring what I think I measure? Am I measuring it in a way I can trust? When I get a number at the end of the day, what does that number mean? How do I interpret it? And it's looking into these kind of the mathematics behind things like questions. And that's really analog to what we do in digital health technology. You, you can strap all the devices that you want on someone, but you really have to know what you're trying to measure and then understand, am I actually measuring that thing? And
Had you, as you were doing your PhD, did you think, oh, I definitely want to go into the like sort of clinical industry side of things, or were you considering an academic path at any point?
It- it's weird because at first when I was doing my undergraduate, I was like, oh, I want to be a clinical psychologist. And then I realized I just talk too much and I'd end up talking my patients to death, and that's not really what I'd be there for. So then I thought I'd go down a research route, and I really liked the research. I hated the really slow moving glacial speed of academic research. So when a position in industry came up, I didn't really know anything about it. It wasn't something that was pushed on us in our university. But I explored it and realized, wow, the pace of science is so much quicker here. And like you can actually see the real impact you're having. And that extends to Digital Medicine Society as well, because we work so closely with tech developers and the pharmaceutical industry, academics too. Um, we really try and like pull that sort of like tech time frame into clinical research, trying to do the most we can to upskill the field in the shortest time possible, because tech's moving so fast, and without the proper structure around it and that scientific rigor around it, we can't get the interpretable like and actionable outcomes that we need. So it's really sitting at that interface.
Yeah, sort of had a similar experience. I mean, it's just not common, or at least it wasn't at the time, for these alternative career paths to be explored. I guess academia was assumed to be the default. So it's
Well, but it's really bizarre. Like, um, come from a psychology background, what do, right? Like, you get your psychology degree, and you either go into academia and do a PhD, or I don't know, bank manager. Now that's being really facetious, but so many people I know have got psychology degrees and go on to be a bank manager, and it's just like, actually, universities, whether it's at undergraduate or PhD level, they're probably a lot better now. This was like years ago, but it felt like, hang on, like you're trying to train us for something. This can't be it. There's got to be other roles. And even when I was approached by the alumni from Cardiff University, I tried to say, hey, look, I'm in the pharma side of things now, or clinical research sides of things now. Like, do you want me to come and do something at your fair? And like, oh yeah, that'd be nice. But never really followed up. It was almost like a nice thing on top. It's like, these are the things you've really got to offer to people, because there is so much more than, oh, I did a nice degree and now I'm doing a job that maybe I didn't need to do a degree for, or I'm stuck and shackled to my academic desk and there's no other options. Even within academia, like, unless you are like collaborating with industry of some sort to make sure that your end results have like the impact it needs to have, for me, it feels like you're missing something, and you could be up leveling your work through like those collaborations. And through my PhD, there was only one person in this quite large department who was really deep on fostering those collaborations. And it seems like such a waste opportunity not to have that at the core of things in academic life, which is like at Dime, that's collaboration is the name of the game. You get everyone on board, so you're getting all these perspectives, but then everyone takes it out into the world. It's a win-win for everybody.
yeah, it really is. And so, is that how you made that official transition in sort of into the clinical consulting space, then doing in sort of collaborations and networking?
Well, no, well, for me, it was actually kind of by accident. I knew about academic collaborations with industry, and I liked the idea. But for me, it was finishing my PhD. I did a short stint as part of a government review into hospital services because it was available. It was a great experience, though harrowing. We can talk about that at some point if you want. But after that, I was just looking for a role, and I was looking at jobs.ac.uk, and it was like, what's going on there? It's academic jobs, and all of a sudden, this consultancy role popped up for psychometrician. I'm like, oh, that sounds cool. What is it? So I researched it. I learned psychometrics from YouTube. Did the interview, and they were like, "Okay, I can tell you've learned this from YouTube, but you got promise." And then on the job learning for my specialist area from YouTube and books and journal articles. So yeah, that's how I got into it.
Amazing. You just took the initiative, found the information that was already out there online, and then just harness that. That's fantastic. So I want to go back to what you just said. What was your harrowing experience along this path?
Oh yeah. So just after my PhD, I was looking for a role, and this government review of children's cardiac services at Bristol Hospital popped up, and I was like, okay, let's see what that's about. And back in the 80s, before I was born, probably, there was this big scandal at a hospital called Bristol Children's Hospital where children were dying, going in for surgery, cardiac surgery, and dying. And they found out that they did a review before my time, and they found out the surgeons were well intentioned, but not very well, like, up to date on their methods. So there were issues there, and they needed more training, and they fixed that problem. But then, maybe 20 years later, it started happening again. Kids were going in for surgery, coming out with poor outcomes, and then dying. And it's like, well, what's going on here? So we did another review. There was a lot going on at the time with the parents wanting to pin this on the surgeons. And as part of our review, we were like, well, the surgeons have actually done a great job. They're really well trained. They're knowledgeable. They know what they're doing. And the kids are coming out of the surgery in good form. And they're going to the intensive care unit in quite good form. But then they're going to the wards. And the wards are specialist cardiac wards. But when we started looking at rotas and funding, we realised that they were actually quite underfunded. And rather than having specialist cardiac nurses on the wards, they were putting bank staff nursing on the ward. Not there's anything wrong with these nurses; they're good nurses, but they weren't cardiac specialist nurses. So the children were then deteriorating, going back to the intensive care unit, and then passing away or ending up with major complications because and all this was underpinned by not having enough funding to employ the right staff. Unfortunately, no one was happy with this outcome because the government who paid for this outcome didn't like the government being blamed for this outcome to some extent. The funding does come from them at the end of the day, and the trust itself. And the parents really wanted to pin this on a name, a surgeon who did wrong, or a group of surgeons did wrong, and that just wasn't the case. So no one was happy with it. So I don't know where really that got picked up and where that went. We were very proud of the work we did, but it was harrowing because we saw what the problem was, and the problem was funding and making sure the right people were looking after the right kids.
Oh, yeah, it's so sad. And like you said, it's not one person responsible. It must have just been so hard seeing the parents and the families.
Exactly that.
Okay, so what happens next? You're in the clinical consulting space. Um, how did you find that? What's that like navigating healthcare regulations?
So this was the first time when I went into the clinical trial space. I was working with CROs, clinical research organizations, who do the research for pharma companies, like upskilling, not just in the technical space, but then also in the regulatory space, and trying to bridge the two, like learning about these really great methods, but also learning that maybe the regulatory space isn't quite there to accept these methods yet. And this is a theme that follows through to sort of digital later on as well. Can be hard to navigate, and having to like settle for methods that are tried and tested but may not be cutting edge. And trying to understand like that interaction was a lot of the work I did. And within that consulting space, um, it's very fast paced. I wanted fast paced science, but sometimes it can be a little bit too fast paced. So it's always trying to like build up your own personal barriers and say and boundaries, and say no, like that. If you want something done and done well, because at the end of the day we're dealing in people's lives, it cannot be done on the time frame you're asking for it. We can do something else in the time frame you're asking for, but what you're asking for is not possible on that time frame. And I think that people within that space probably need to heed that lesson a bit more, to make sure that the job is always done to the to the high standards you can. I completely understand timelines, but I think that sometimes in the consultancy space, it can be a case of wanting things done yesterday when time and care is needed to do it right, when there are actual outcomes at risk here. The worst things that I've kind of like experienced is probably like I like good measurement, but like settling either because it's the done thing, there's precedence, or because there isn't time for potentially maybe not as good measurement strategy as one that may be an improved or more sensitive measurement strategy, which means that maybe you don't find what you thought you're going to find for your drug, but you don't know if that's the drug hasn't worked, or if the measure you're using isn't good enough to detect the drug has worked. And that's the sort of things I've brought forward into the stuff we do at Digital Medicine Society, is just really about let's get the basis there so everyone's working from the same platform and understands that when you're measuring stuff, you have to get that core principle right to ensure that you're not missing something that is actually happening and can make people's lives better.
Yeah, it seems to be fundamental. You don't want to be mismeasuring something because then the whole foundation is off. So, what is your role at Digital Medicine Society? And maybe you can abbreviate it. So, can you tell us a bit more about DIME in general and what it does?
Yeah, it's a Digital Medicine Society dime. We're at the intersection of healthcare and technology. And what we're trying to do is uh, put the foundations in for the implementation of technology to improve healthcare for everyone and make it more accessible and equitable for everyone as well. Um, my role in particular is heading up several projects, and I'll just talk about this, the sleep one today, as we focused a bit on that. And these are pre-competitive collaborations, bringing everyone from all walks of industry, tech development, academia, clinical experts, foundations like National Sleep Foundation together, and trying to say, hey, look, we all know, in this case, sleep is important, but how do we get to a point where we can um, break it down? Like, sleep isn't one thing, right? It's getting to sleep, it's staying asleep, it's being able to get up in the morning, it's feeling well rested. There's loads of elements there. How do we break it down into elements, but pick the elements that matter most, both to clinicians and to patients, and then really define those so that people can um, have the definitions they need to go forward and say, okay, I'm measuring how long it takes someone to get to sleep, but what are the parameters, the measurement parameters I need to say, when do I start that? Is it when someone gets into bed? Is it when they've finished reading their book or looking at their phone? When are they actually asleep? Is it when they first doze off? Should they be in asleep for a certain amount of time before you say, yeah, they're asleep? And it's just, I can't tell every technology developer to do this in the same way, but what we can say is, however you're doing it, make it very clear what you're doing so people can really understand the data they're getting from it. So the whole idea here is to then put these core measures together so that the field can take them. We can move not away from, but at least supplement, or in some cases move away from polysomnography in the lab, more into a naturalistic environment. And really the whole project developing our core measures of core digital measures of sleep, and developing our resources which help people implement it in their work, whether it's clinical practice or clinical research, or just someone like you or I, you just care about like monitoring our sleep, like so they can actually use the core measures, understand them, and interpret them. But the best thing about this is that when we sat down, we realized, who needs this, right? Because the hardcore sleep scientists don't need this sort of work. Not yet, anyway. We're not going to change hearts and minds for people who have grown up in hard sleep science. And they are doing all their work in polysomnography labs, for the most part, anyway, not all of them. But there's, like I said earlier, there's a whole wealth of practice and researchers just don't have access to the cost of a polysomnography lab, the time it takes out of your day to go and sleep there, and so on and so forth, let alone that it's not naturalistic. So really, a lot of our resources were aimed at experts, be they clinicians or researchers, who may have an interest in understanding sleep of their patients in some way, or sleep of their participants in some way, but it's not core. If you're studying asthma or depression or diabetes or Alzheimer's, like sleep has an element, and sleep disruption has an element in all of this. It's never going to be like really high up in your clinical trial endpoint hierarchy quite often, but it is of interest. And if your medication helps, I know, reduce symptoms of coughing, or it helps improve breathing in asthma, so they're not waking up as much in the night, or they're able to get to sleep, that's a real important benefit for patients. Couldn't do that before as reliably and as like transparently and as consistently, because every technology is kind of doing this differently, and there's different levels of transparency there. But now with these core measures to put together and resources to help implement them, people can really say, have those negotiations with people, with researchers can have those negotiations with vendors and say, hey, look, I care about this part of sleep in my asthma population. How does your device measure this part of sleep? Oh, okay, actually, the core measures say, like, ideally we'd measure it between this point and this point. How do you line up against that? And they can make informed choices and actually start to work with their clinical teams on like clinical trial research to implement digital health technology to measure that and see if their medication leads to not just improvement in their symptoms and conditions, but also the sleep related impacts as well.
I mean, historically, I think as we discussed at the beginning, it's like people thought a lot about just amount of time in bed or total sleep duration. Are there certain measures you feel like are coming out to be really important, or what do you think are some of the parameters and measures of sleep?
A lot of our measures are things you will see in the literature, but we've tried to put like more sort of standard definitions around them. So things like sleep onset latency, the amount of time it takes someone to get to sleep, or total sleep time. Well, how are you how are you measuring that is one, because if it's just from when you get into bed to when you fall asleep, that's very different to when you attempted to start sleeping to when you fall asleep. And also, like, how do you define falling asleep? So there's elements of this which are sleep research people will be familiar with. We're just trying to like standardize it, or at least get people to tell us as part of their research studies, what do you mean by when you say sleep onset latency, time it takes to get to sleep? What do you mean by that? But where digital health technology comes into this, especially, is things like we've called it like napping, daytime napping, and it's this idea that when you're not trying to get to sleep, you could either intentionally take a nap because you're exhausted or as a coping mechanism, or you could unintentionally take a nap because of condition. How do you do that outside the sleep lab? Well, you can ask people how many naps do you take, was it intentional, how long were they, or you can use digital health to the digital health technology to do that, because it's not possible in a polysomnography lab to do that. There are tests you can do. It involves sitting people in a dark room and telling them, please stay awake. But that's really, really artificial. And like timing how long it takes them to not to be awake anymore. That's really artificial. But actually measuring like things in like hypersomnia, narcolepsy, people think of as well. How long it takes how often are these people just falling asleep, and how long are they asleep for? It's really important. But then there's this other element as well, which is really, really focused in digital health technology. And it's called the sleep regularity index. And this is all about like the consistency of your sleep, night on night on night on night on night. Are you getting to sleep at the same time? Are you waking up at the same time? Are you asleep for the same amount of time? If I measure you at 3 a.m. in the morning one night, are you asleep? And are you asleep the following night at 3 a.m. and the following night at 3 a.m.? Like, what are the variations in your sleep? Because this idea of sleep regularity is really, turns out it looks like it's really important for health in general, can be very disrupted in some conditions. And unless you want someone to live in a polysomnography lab, it's pretty much impossible to measure, and doesn't mean anything anyway, because in a polysomnography lab, they tell you when you're going to sleep. So it sort of disrupts the measure by measuring it. So having access to digital health technology for this is really important.
Yeah, habitual regularity is really interesting. In terms of then capturing this outside of the lab, as we were saying, how do you currently feel about the devices available? So current wearables, and where do you think the future is? Technologies.
So, as part of this project, we did do a landscape analysis of all the technologies that are out there, and not all the technologies. We did limit it to things that people can actually, go out and purchase or contract, because that's where we impact stuff, right? So we looked across, and we put all the evidence into a library so that people can assess the evidence for themselves and make up their own mind. Um, for me, although I'm not going to go into like specific brands and such like, um, I think there's a really great shift going from things like just uh, actigraphy based measures, which just measure movement, which is standard for a lot of measures, and that's one way of doing it, and you may get sort of sleep wake. But we're seeing a shift from that to things that start to measure either multimodal, so they'll take in things like um, photoplasmography. Maybe I've said that right. To try and like go alongside the actigraphy to try and get more accurate assessments of when someone was resting versus when they were asleep. But now the new generation, are things like headbands and earbuds that people can wear during sleep and are collecting brain activity data. And these things are going a step further, because once you start collecting brain activity data, you can start really trying to get into those specific sleep staging that we see in the lab. That we call them N1, N2, N3, REM, awake. But really, these all are different parts of sleep which have their own little cool functions as well. But all of the sort of ideas of like core measures and the understanding of things like sleep onset latency, total sleep time, etc., can be derived from that. But they can also be used as biomarkers as well. Like we're talking now, when we talk about core measures, we're talking about clinical outcomes assessments, things that are important to patients that they can feel and they can understand, right? Whereas when we and those can be derived from brain activity. But the great thing about the way the field is going, more these brain activity assessments, is that you can assess like how long was someone in their REM sleep, how long were they in N3 stage of sleep, and how does that then relate to the onset of a later disease or like a titration in medication. And this is the exciting way we can go, because that may not be explainable in a patient-centric term. Like no one's going to say, "Oh, I got an extra 20 minutes of N3 sleep last night. I feel great." That's not how that works. But knowing that N3 was longer than average or shorter than average allows us to understand how that person's condition is progressing, or if they need a medication change. And that's where the important benefit of those also lie. Looking at both sides of the coin, the patient relevant and the clinical, the other clinical impacts that aren't directly patient facing.
Thinking about not just even the early onset of disease, but like you were saying, the interaction, the external things you're taking, whether it's medications, then I'm also just thinking, well, maybe certain foods, sensitive to coffee, for example.
Exactly. And you can see this with there's research out there like when, when should you have your beer? Probably 11 a.m. in the morning, because after that, it's probably disrupting your sleep. But we shouldn't probably advocating for people to go on their nights out at 11 a.m. and then carry on with their day, because that doesn't quite work with society. But all these things, and just like the impact of, I don't know, you had dinner late, you have dinner later in the evening. Like, how does that affect your sleep? And at the minute, these devices are like research grade, but it'd be really interesting just to, on a personal level, to there's a huge community of like self loggers out there who just monitor their own like health data, and to see if like, oh yeah, actually I have been having dinner late for the last week and that's really disrupted like my sleep cycles compared to before. I should probably eat earlier, etc., or not work so late, etc. Things like this I think are going to be a really great move for the field, that people can start understanding what activities they do are affecting like how their brain is actually doing what a brain should do.
Yeah, I've been telling my team we should be having mid-morning cocktails.
Yeah, exactly. And now you've got we have to find the paper for that, but yeah, exactly, because otherwise the I think it's like the half-life of the alcohol just stays in your system and messes you up and messes your sleep cycle. So
How do you feel about your own sleep? Are you someone who tracks religiously? Do you take naps?
well, no, I don't nap unless I'm unwell. What I did when I first started this project was tracking my sleep religiously, but I found that I'll do that from time to time, but it wasn't so helpful as just starting to set like good habits. So one of the things I do now is, where possible, and it's not always possible, I got a lot to get done, but where possible, I'll try and get to bed at between 11 and 11:30, and I'll wake up between 7:30 and 8:30, and I'll try and get that sort of like quite consistent with an hour or so like sleep. And that way I can I'm kind of ensuring that my body knows sleep's coming and it's getting the most out of it. I don't often wake up in the night apart from children, and that's a disruption, but other than that I'm a good sleeper. And but I do have lots of dreams, and I know for my own sleep, if I've had like some wine in the evening or something, I have the most vivid dreams in the world, whereas without that I have an uneventful night's sleep. So those are the insights I've gotten. Yeah, I just try and keep it as regular as possible.
I've struggled with sleep a little bit. It's a lot better than it used to be, but yeah, since I've circadian rhythms field, I do feel like it just made me hyper aware of my sleep schedule. It's improved a lot. I do feel like as I've gotten older, if I do have alcohol, that can really disrupt things. Like it never used to be much, but now if it's more than a drink or two, I do feel like sleep quality is reduced significantly. Um, I would say I don't wake up too much now, but I could be better at the consistency in when I go to bed in the evenings.
I still find that a bit of a struggle because if I'm doing computer programming, for example, which I do a bit of, um, I get so absorbed into it. I'll look at the clock and it's like, oh, it's 1:30. This has gone out the window already. So it depends on what I'm doing, and like losing yourself in that awareness of time is a great feeling. But the consequences are sleep. So at least I'm not losing it to Netflix, I guess. I think a Netflix report came out last year, and it was something like their biggest competitor was sleep. So they were trying to fight against it, which I think is a public health concern, actually. But yeah, so like I think that yeah, that regularity and trying to not do those routines that are going to affect you badly is big. There's been some research recently into something called um, is it sleep revenge procrastination? It's this idea that I've been working all day, I've been looking after kids, I've had to run the errands and clean the house. I am staying awake. And it's like, and what you do when you stay awake? Nothing. But it's my time and I'm staying awake and that's that. And you can't stop me. And it's this idea of like, that's a pretty harmful behavior. I mean, there are many harmful behaviors you can do, and that's probably on par with a lot of them because it is really damaging you. Um,
Outside of screens and sleep deprivation, rumor has it that you're a chief magic maker, mastermind extraordinaire. Tell me more about that.
that's like I put that so as part of working with the Digital Medicine Society because they're US based and I'm based in France. I had to set up my own consultancy to work with them. So I'm employed by them through my own company. But alongside that, I also I get contract out to others on traditional psychometrics. I was like, well, what do I put down? Because I hate it when I go on LinkedIn and I see things like president or co-founder or whatever, like, so I just put chief magic maker and or whatever on there as a joke. But then one day someone sent me a contract through with that as my title. I'm like, oh geez, no, I've got to put my actual title on here now. So yeah, that's nothing more than just a business thing and a joke, and sometimes it goes wrong. Um but like outside of work, it's mostly just trying to spend time with kids, really. I get so little time with them when they're growing up, and it's just little things like we play at the minute. It's Princess Peach Showtime, and we all gather around and share the controls around and play computer games to each other. Sometimes we like build blocks or whatever that little kids do, um, and I'm cooking for my family. Also like massive road of like self improvement at the minute. So, like I'm going through a transition process, male to female transition, and on Friday actually I've got like facial feminization surgery. So I know I'm wonderful, I'm beautiful, but I'm going to have this like big surgery to like to feminize my face aspects a bit more. And although I shouldn't call that a hobby because it's not a hobby, it's one of these things where it takes up so much of your time. This idea of like, oh, have I got my medications and so on and so forth, and it's like this is like a patient perspective that I've never had before. And I'm thinking to other conditions where people are like putting everything in their life around like medication for something or another. And I'm like, wow, yeah, what I'm doing is another side of that. And it's given me like a look into into that world of all the things that people do that occupy their time because they are a patient. I'm really looking forward to having this surgery and have been for a while. And the time after to recover as well, where maybe I can, when I'm not so sleepy, play some more games with my kids. But yeah, outside of work at the minute, there's just a lot of changes in my life. But I'm looking forward to when that settles down a bit more, getting back to board games with my wife and going to a bar in summer and just chatting in the French summer evenings with a Belgian beer or glass of wine.
In terms of self improvement, if you could give you one piece of advice or wisdom, really in the areas of anything you like, whether it's work, productivity, health, relationships, growth, anything, what do you think it would be and why?
The thing that served me well was always ask questions. You might find yourself at a conference, listen and ask a question, and ask the question that you think the person wants to answer, not the question that you really want to ask a lot of the times. Because if you're kind and you give people the space to show off their knowledge, I think that puts them in a good light and fosters a relationship between you. And from doing that, I've managed to also myself get loads of opportunities to work with people and collaborate on things like developing new methods or writing manuscripts and putting myself out there just from the opportunity to show that I was interested in what someone was doing and then give them the time back to tell everyone more about what they're doing. And that just fosters relationships professionally and personally as well. So that would be my advice.
And curiosity about everything is just one of those wonderful traits that everyone can have. Perfect. Thank you for sharing all your wisdom.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful to be here and have a chat with you today. So thanks very much.